The Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope. A very, very good morning to all of you listening in. Super excited to be here because I have a lot of interesting things to be talking about with you today. So I'm super excited to be here and a very good morning to all of you. Now, I have a lot of exciting things coming your way, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But today, or right now rather, I will be talking about the post pandemic boom. And this is something that really needs to be addressed because a lot of us have a lot of doubts about how the pandemic or rather how our economies would be, especially after the pandemic, right? So obviously this is very important. That's why I'm going to be talking about it, and I'm also super excited to be here because if you have any messages, shout outs, anything that you or even questions, opinions, things that you want to share with us, make sure you text me on 07852473473 because you can get in touch with me and I can share your opinions, your thoughts with everyone else who's listening in as well. And that will also help me to have a conversation, to possibly share your thoughts, to share your perspectives also with everyone else who's tuning in. So super excited for that. So make sure you stay tuned for that. And also, if you really like the content that we provide, if you really like what we talk and what we educate people on, then make sure to follow us on our socials, which is Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Okay, and if you follow us on our socials, you can stay up to date. You can put on your notifications and you can stay up to date with everything that we talk about, with everything that we have, and that is super exciting because it'll help you. It will help you stay focused, and it will also help you be aware and more alert of what is going on. Okay, so make sure you do that. But right now, let's get into it. Let's get into the post pandemic boom and why it's something that we need to talk about. Okay, so we've been in this situation for 2 years, and one of the very obvious questions that we all have, one of the very obvious doubts, or one of the very obvious inquiries that we have about our future is especially how the pandemic would, what kind of effect the pandemic would have on our economy, right? How it would impact us and how it would necessarily change our lives, change our economies, and what kind of differences and adjustments we need to make, right? So that's one of the main questions that's been on everyone's minds ever since this pandemic began, right? And obviously, with the way the things are functioning right now, with all the changes that are there, it's pretty normal or pretty it's the most normal thing for you to expect there to be a lot of changes, right? So obviously there's a lot of people expect a depression, which is very normal because when you've been in an instance like this, when you are when you're in a pandemic where there's a lot of where things don't function the same way, the economy doesn't function the same way, there is a lot of doubt that you have, right? So obviously a lot of people expect a depression, and we already know we're somewhat in a recession because our GDP is falling. People can't go to work and be productive as much as they used to be, and that's pretty obvious. I mean, that's a given the fact that we're in this pandemic. You can't really expect people to be working at their best for the GDP to be higher than when it was normal, right? These things were expected, so obviously the recession was something expected, and that's fine because we completely understand that given the status, given the way things are happening right now, it's pretty much it's pretty difficult to actually imagine if there was to imagine it to be normal. It's very difficult for you to imagine that things would be normal, that we would be having a normal output, we would be having a normal GDP, and expect these things to just go back to normal, right? Basically, that is what I'm trying to say. But let's also look back in history. Let's all, or rather look back at history and look at all the examples that other pandemics have provided and how the economic situations have actually been after those pandemic, right? So obviously I'm talking about the other pandemics like the Spanish flu or even the Black Death. Now those were huge pandemics, and there was a lot of disease, death that was caused by it, and also there was a lot of changes. There was a lot of differences, or there was a lot of adjustments that people had to come to terms with, because it was a lot to process, right? So obviously it's very, very obvious, it's a given that during a pandemic, that there is a fall in GDP, and there's also massive, massive losses, right? And this is obviously because of population loss. This is because of loss of resources, loss of wealth, and the economy being at a standstill. Now that is a very obvious thing, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So many people are dying because we don't know what this disease is like. We don't know its consequences. We don't know the impacts it have, right? Because we've just been in this pandemic for 2 years, and even then we've just found vaccines, and we're just coming to terms with with all these survivors of the pandemic, right? And even if you've survived the pandemic, that means that sometimes you actually have the after effects of the pandemic. And like I said some time back, how even though you've completely recovered from COVID-19, you can still have some of its symptoms, even 12 weeks, and that's the minimum, right? 12 weeks after you've been cured. And what that goes to show is that a lot of this pandemic is still unknown. But if we were to look at all the pandemics back in the past, and I'm talking about like the Spanish flu, talking about rather the Spanish flu and Black Death, we've seen how much of chaos and destruction it has caused, right? Obviously in the short term the economy hasn't been that good, but in the long term it has actually helped the economy, right? Because for example, during the Spanish flu there was actually a fall of 12 to 15% in the second quarter of 1921, right? And that is a lot, because you're potentially talking about, even right now you're potentially talking about the loss of millions and millions of profit of GDP. And that's very important, because as a country you need your economy, you need your economy to be at a good place, because you need to make sure that there is a good living standard in your country, that people can afford these things and afford to live life, right? But obviously things changed during the pandemic, right? And for example, and like I said, during the Spanish flu, there was a 12 to 15% fall in the second quarter of 1921. Now, another thing that pandemics distinctively show is the large inequalities that exist between society, right? And I'm talking about the gap between the rich and the poor. And even now that's very obvious, because we've seen the huge gap between the rich and the poor in the middle of the pandemic. Because if you're poor, if you are from the labor class, if you're from the labor class, if you're constantly going to work, and your job is definitely more than 9 hours long, um chances are the pandemic really affected you really bad. And obviously it's because when you're not earning as much, when you're not a rich person in society, it affects us a lot, right? Because the thing is, when you're rich you have far greater access to resources, you have far greater access to things like food, healthcare, nutrition, housing, whatever it is. You have far better access than for people, right? And obviously because of that, it just goes to show that pandemics actually affect the poor way more than it affects the rich, right? And that actually also shows a huge economic divide that is there within a country, or even within the world, when a pandemic happens, right? And obviously, like I said before, it affects laborers far worse than others, right? Because they're constantly going to work, because that is how they survive. People who live on daily wages, people who live on weekly wages, it's very, very hard for them to survive. It's actually very hard for them to actually for things to get back to normal. And another thing is, when normal people, or people laborers actually are caught up in situations like this, they tend to be in debt more and more. Obviously when you're trying so hard to when you're finding it so hard to survive, when you constantly have to worry about the increase in prices because of inflation and different things like that, you're constantly on the edge, right? And a lot of these people have had to actually get debts to make sure that they can live. So obviously a lot of things like this happens during a pandemic, and we can currently see it happen right here as well. So obviously these are the things that we need to focus on when we're talking about an economic boom, right? And also, that is what needs to be kept in mind. So when we come back later, after that small break, we'll actually be talking about the post-pandemic boom, the uncertainty of it, how crisis actually encourage people and businesses to try new ways of doing things, and how political upheaval is actually followed by unpredictable economic consequences. Now, these are things that we've all seen in the past. We've seen this happen in literally every pandemic, or forget about pandemics, even when the world war happened, these things happened, right? So obviously these are the things that I'll be focusing on. So make sure you stay tuned for that, because I have a lot to talk to you about, especially when it comes to economies, especially when it comes to vaccine inequality as well. There's a lot to be talking about, so make sure you stay tuned. But right now, let's head into a little break.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh. So that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, got me thinking. You want to stand out. Why do you want to stand out though so much, especially with these kind of shirts when you're writing? There must be a purpose behind it, right?
Well, when you say a purpose, Nick, what I do, I wear the shirts, mainly one because they're nice and bright, so they make me visible, especially if I'm riding on the road.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's very important, right? Because you want cars, yeah.
Very important. And also, like, people see me in like calves, and perhaps I shouldn't be saying this on here, I suppose, but in the bar afterwards.
All right.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh, so that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, you look like a guy who would do.
You know me too well. You know me too well, Nick.
Climb Mount Everest. That is one of that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do, hopefully.
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. I mean, okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest, maybe the base camp at least.
They're talking about mental health. Well, if you went out and got some exercise in the fresh air, that would improve your mental health. It will make you feel better.
That's true. That is true. I wholeheartedly agree. But then for some people, it's how do you find the motivation to, especially when it comes to riding a bicycle, to do it again and again and again and again? It's a cycle that you have to be used to. How do you do it? What makes you wake up in the morning and decide, hey, I'm going to pick my bike up today. I'm going to cycle. What makes you want to do that?
What makes me want to do that?
Yeah. What do you like? What could you give listeners, like people listening in right now? What kind of tip could you give them?
Well, the first tip I would give them, if you haven't tried it before, try it. It can open up new horizons. It will make you fitter. It will definitely make you fitter. Cycling is one of the best forms of aerobic exercise you can do.
It sounds like, I mean, if you think about it, yeah, it sounds like great fun. Because what essentially you're trying to say is also at the same time, when you, if you look at it from this perspective, with regards to mental health, especially when you look at it with mental health, this is another way to fight it. I feel like you go outside, you meet more people, you interact with, socially, you will interact with more people, and you're keeping fit, you're making connections, you're breathing in the good and exhaling the bad. I feel like that's a great thing right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got a better way with words than I have, I'll tell you. But you're quite right. What you say there.
I mean, I've been doing this for quite some time. I mean, hey, you'll get the hang of it.
I've been doing it for about 10 minutes now, so yeah.
That I can never really understand people staying in one room the whole day when you can have the world to see. I am a traveler. I travel. I love traveling. Traveling is just one of the things I do. And yeah, on top of my bucket list was, to one time, hopefully when I get there, go to Nepal and climb Mount Everest. That is one of that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do, hopefully.
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. I mean, okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest, maybe the base camp at least.
Base camp, yeah.
At least.
Would you be able to cycle there?
Oh.
Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope. And earlier we were talking about the post pandemic boom and what kind of future is obviously there for us when we are facing a pandemic. So that's what we were talking about. If you're just tuning in, a very good morning. I'm super excited to be here and tell you about these things because these are questions that we've all had. These are obviously, doubts we've all had for the past 2 years, almost 2 years, because we've constantly been stressed out about the pandemic, the state of our economy, the state of our mental health, and the state of our lives, because obviously it's been a lot to adjust to. So obviously that's what we were talking about now. That's what we were talking about earlier, right? And I said when I come back I will talk about different things, such as that we'll be discussing different things rather, like the post-pandemic boom, the uncertainty, and how crisis actually encourage people to how crisis actually encourage people to find different ways of spending, to be more innovative, and to have their own startups. And that's something we've seen as well, which I will get into in a few more minutes. And I also said we'll be talking about how a political upheaval has a lot of unpredictable economic consequences, especially when when the country or the people are going through situations like a pandemic or even a war, right? That's what we were talking about. Now, if you're tuning in, a very good morning. Super excited to be here, and I'm so excited to share my thoughts. But also, I would be really, really glad if you could share your thoughts with me as well. Make sure you text me on 07852 and share your thoughts with me, because that is something I would really love to do, or I would love to hear about your thoughts, so I can make this conversation so much better, and I can share your opinions as well, along with my opinions, right? So obviously, I'm super excited to do that. So make sure you do that as well. But let's get into it. Let's talk about consumer spending and uncertainty, especially in the middle of a pandemic, because that is something very, very important. Okay, now let's get into the very basic, very obvious thing that people do when they're caught up in emergency situations like a pandemic or even a war. People tend to save more, and that's a very human thing to do, and that is what any rational person would do, because you understand that when you're in the middle of an emergency situation, you don't know what kind of emergency it is. You don't necessarily have a lot of information about it, and you don't necessarily know how much of money you'll need, right? So the first thing you would do is obviously save all the money you can, and you would also try to not you would cut off unnecessary spending. You would just buy what is needed, what is essential for your family or for yourself, and just try to stay away from all the unnecessary spending as much as possible, right? That's what any normal person would do, and that's exactly what people have been doing during this pandemic as well. As soon as the pandemic happened, people just started saving more and more. And even when we take a look back into history, when we're looking at earlier pandemics, it suggests that during the acute phase of the pandemic, people actually accumulated savings and reduced spending opportunities, right? And that's what I would do as well, especially if everything is so new to you, everything is so confusing, and you have no idea what you should be doing, or no idea what you are doing. The first thing you would do is save, right? And that is something that's very important, because in those emergencies you need money, and because of that you need to start saving, right? So obviously the rate of saving actually doubles in situations like this. So for example, in the first half of the 1870s, when there was an outbreak of smallpox in Britain, or rather when there is an outbreak of smallpox, Britain's household savings actually doubled, right? And the same thing happened during World War II as well. And that is evidence enough for you to know that during pandemics, during these wars, or even huge emergencies that I'm talking about, during situations like that, people tend to save more, right? And that's how it is. So obviously, while we're looking at history to sort of compare and contrast what kind of things people have done, how economies have taken a turn, when you look back into history, it also offers this guide on what people did when life got back to normal, right? And that also just goes to show that eventually, when things are much better, when there is much more certainty than right now, people will eventually start doing the things they do. They will start doing different things just so they can get back into normal life, right? So obviously, this is what we're talking about. Now, when we're getting back to normal, especially after the pandemic, spending of people actually rise, and it also prompts employment to recover. So because when people are spending more, when people need more items than they did before, then obviously what they would do is essentially try to, they would go to shops and they would buy stuff more and more, right? And obviously this means that there will also be an increase in production, because now everything's back to normal, people are getting back to their normal life, so the demand will eventually come back, right? And for the demand to actually happen, there needs to be a supply. Right now, that's basic economics. And talking about it actually brings back so many memories, because I used to do econ back when I was in school, and that was my absolute favorite subject. So for there to be a demand, there also needs to be a supply, right? So when demand and supply are rising, that is when you understand that things are slowly getting back to normal. Now in the short term, pandemics actually tend to have a lot of negative risks or negative effects, but the thing is, in the long term, it's actually really helpful, right? So let's look at it from this perspective, right? Now, since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, official statistics actually show that the total household savings have increased, and total household debt remains mostly unchanged, and that's largely due to a fall in spending on non-essential items over lockdown. So the household savings ratio, which is household savings as a proportion of disposable of household disposable income, actually increased from 9.6 in quarter one of 2020 to 29.1 in quarter two of 2020. Now, like I said, right, when you are in situations like this, your savings double, right? And it's very important. This is how people react. You can basically see people's behavior through when you analyze your economy, right? And obviously this was a record high, because this was the first time, savings increased so much since the series began in 1987. Now deposits in bank accounts as well increased by 44.6 billion in the second quarter of 2020. So obviously, on a whole, when you're looking at it on a whole, the household savings have actually risen and debt has decreased. But also, you need to keep in mind that there is evidence to suggest that some households, particularly obviously the ones with low incomes, have actually run down on savings and increased debt since the start of the pandemic. Now, like I said earlier, people from low income households don't necessarily have a lot of money, right? Which means that even the money they earn, they just use it on essential items, what they need to survive. Now, obviously, when the country is shut down, when we're all in lockdown and things aren't working out the same way it used to, it means that these people won't be able to get their daily wages the same way they did, which means that now they actually have to start using up all the little savings they have just to survive. And that also means that debt will actually increase, because when you're trying to survive in a pandemic, when things are going things are getting more and more expensive, you need to borrow to make sure you survive. So obviously, when it comes to low income households, this has affected them very adversely, because their debt burden has actually increased in comparison to their savings, which have reduced, right? So the official, or rather, the Office for National Statistics Opinions and Lifestyle Survey found that by July, 13.3 people said that they have had to borrow money, or have had to use credit more than usual since the coronavirus pandemic. So this is what I meant when I said a lot of people have to depend on credit. A lot of people have to borrow money just so that they can survive, right? And the Resolution Foundation also found that 54% of adults in families from the lowest income families actually borrowed more in March, in the time period between March and June, to cover everyday costs like food and housing. Right now, obviously, that's something that we really need to focus on, because a lot of people from low income households, or a lot of people who used to earn daily wages, are actually really suffering, right? So obviously, while on a whole, or while or in the long term, it might be actually good, we need to sort of address the problems that are happening right now as well, and that is addressing these issues of people like people from low income households, people who've had to borrow twice, or they've had to borrow more than they used to borrow before the pandemic. We need to focus on those people. We need to make sure that the government addresses those people. The government actually helps these people as well, because they're suffering a lot, given the fact that the daily wage workers, or the income isn't that the income isn't that high. That means they are severely affected by it. And that is why when we're talking about the growth of when we're talking about the growth of the economy, in terms of all these families, when we're talking about the economy, in terms of all these people as well, it's very important that we focus on these people and we try to address their needs as well. So obviously, like I said, while savings double, and while a lot of people get rid of their unnecessary spending opportunities, while they get rid of buying all these non-essential goods, it also means that a lot of other people will be suffering. And even if it wasn't in terms of money, even if it wasn't in terms of income and surviving, people from low income households have actually had other hardships as well, right? And I'm talking about not being and not necessarily being able to afford all these online classes, different things like that, right? Because wage inequality exists, right? And we've seen how the pandemic has actually, if anything, exacerbated this wage inequality, and has made the wage inequality more distinctive, right? And that's very important, because we need to understand that when we have situations like pandemics, when we have situations like wars, this is when the inequalities in society tend to be more distinctive, tend to be more visible, and people tend to notice it more, right? And obviously, this generation tends to, or rather this generation is more socially aware, and they're so much more conscious than past generations, right? So they're constantly focused on these people. They're always trying to help people who come from low income families. They're always trying to talk about these people as well. And what's important about that is they're bringing these people's issues to the table. They're making the issues be heard. They're giving these people a platform. And that's very important, because when there's constant attention, when people are constantly focusing on the fact that people from low income families are actually suffering a lot during this pandemic, it means that now the government obviously has an inherent right to help these people, right? And it's because they have this inherent right to help people, they actually really need to make sure that people can survive during this pandemic. And that is why this is something that the government needs to focus on as well, right? So because we're talking about how the pandemic, or rather we're talking about how the current situation could affect the post-pandemic economy, we also need to make sure that we address these issues, because if we don't try to address these issues right now, it's going to create a lot it's going to create a lot of difficulty moving forward. So obviously that needs to be kept in mind. But right now, let's head into a small break, because I have a lot more to talk to you about. I have a lot more things to get into. I'm super excited to do that, but obviously we need to get into a little break just before we come back again to talk about the post-pandemic economy.
The Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah back on the Kaleidoscope. And earlier we were talking about the uncertainty that is there because of the pandemic and how people spending changes during a pandemic. And obviously, I was talking about things like how people's savings double, how people actually, try to save as much as they can, how they try to get rid of all these unnecessary spending opportunities that they have, and they try to focus on buying essential goods while cutting off all non-essential goods that they buy, right? And obviously, I was also talking about low income families and how these low income families have had to deal with the pandemic and how they've had to, and how, or rather, how the debt burden has increased significantly than before the pandemic, simply because they couldn't go to work and earn money the same way that they used to, which means that they had a reduction in income, right? That is what I was talking about. A very good morning if you're just tuning in. I'm Sarah on the Kaleidoscope, and I'll be keeping you company all the way until 9 a.m. Now, if you have any questions, if you have any opinions, any messages, any thoughts that you want to share with us, well, you can do so. You can just text me on 07852 473 473, and we can get into a discussion about this or even something else that you want me to talk about, right? Obviously, right now we're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about the post-pandemic boom, and that's what we're talking about. So obviously, if you have any other things you want me to talk about, well, make sure you get in touch so I can make everyone who's listening in aware about it, and I can share your thoughts and opinions on it as well. Now, let's move on to actually how crisis actually encourage people and businesses to try out new things. Now, that's something that's very important because when you are in the middle of a pandemic, you actually have to focus on these different things, right? Like, how am I going to earn more money? Especially when a lot of people have lost their jobs, when a lot of people are suffering from the impact of the pandemic, when a lot of people are not earning as much as they used to, because there have been salary cuts not just here but all around the world, and a lot of people are actually facing a lot of difficulties because of those things, right? So when things like this happen, how does it actually encourage people and businesses to try out new things? Now, that's a very important question that needs to be discussed, right? And that actually relates to the supply side of economics. And that is basically about how and where goods and services are produced, right? Now, I said that a lot of people actually appear to be less keen on spending money for unnecessary things during a pandemic, obviously. And I said that's a lot of people, it's most people, because when you're in the middle of a pandemic, you're in this unknown situation, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you have a lot of things to focus on, and the first thing you would do is essentially save money so you can use that money just in case there are different just in case you need that money. So obviously people start saving more, savings doubled, and households actually their savings doubled because they wanted to have extra money just in case another emergency arose, right? But we need to understand that while a lot of people are saving money, there are also other people who are more than willing to try new ways of making money. And this is what's important. This is something that is very positive. This is something that we look forward to, especially in times of crisis like this. It's the fact that people find new ways to make money. People have startups, people introduce new businesses, and that essentially means that it will help the economic grow, right? Because like I said, when you're going through a pandemic, when you're going through a situation like this, a lot of people are actually finding it hard to survive, right? And a lot of people have to make these choices. They have to do things differently than they did before, right? But also, while that happens, it encourages people to find more ways to use their money, to find more ways to spend them on money, or rather earn money, because they understand that after a while that you can't survive without any income, right? You need some form of income, and at least a little, a certain amount of income is better than nothing at all. So obviously, when things like that happen, people tend to find new ways to spend money, or to even start up new things. And I'm talking about things like startup businesses. Now, earlier we were also looking at history to give us examples to show what kind of life it would be like after the pandemic, or even how economies would recover or even fall after the pandemic, right? So so let's do that again, because we're talking about the Black Death. Okay, so I'm going back in history to talk about the Black Death, because there are a lot of lessons we can take from the plagues and pandemics that existed before that, right? So obviously, historians believe that when the Black Death happened, it actually made Europeans more adventurous because it was better to be piling onto a ship and setting sail for new lands, and it was, less risky for you to be staying at home, especially when people were dying at home, right? And people were more open to the idea of adventuring. People were more open to the idea of exploring because it made more sense, right? And it was also less risky because if you stayed at home, if you stayed back in England during the whole Black Death, chances are you'd have probably gotten infected and died, or it could have had a lot of after effects even if you managed to survive, right? But the thing is, they found it less risky and they found it so much more better to just pile their stuff and to get into a ship and leave, because that way they actually had little or no chances of actually getting the Black Death. It was safer for themselves, and sometimes it was safer for their families as well. So that's the exact same thing that's happening right now, right? It's so much less riskier for you to stay at home and completely lose your or rather, it's more riskier for you to stay at home and completely lose your income, rather than it is for you to go out and, or not even go out. You can't go out, but it's so much better if you can have your own business, have your own startup company that will at least let you earn some form of income. Right now, obviously, that is what is happening right now as well. And according to research, according to statistics that is available right now, today's new business formation is once again surging across the world because entrepreneurs are seeking to fill gaps in the market. Now, this is another thing that we need to understand. Obviously, when there's a pandemic, when people are dying, when people are losing jobs, there are gaps in the market. Stocks fall, things like that happen. The value of shares fall, and obviously, when things like that happen, there's a lot of gaps in the market, right? Which means if these gaps aren't filled, it could potentially result in even further decrease of these stocks, of these shares, etc. Right? So obviously, when there are these gaps in the market, people or entrepreneurs out there are trying to fill it. They're trying to find new ways or come up with new business ideas, especially in the middle of a pandemic, to fill these gaps. And during a pandemic, you can especially be really, really innovative. If you think about it, if you can, or if you can find yourself someone who supplies all these face masks, hand sanitizers, things like that, you can make a business out of it, right? Exactly. So obviously, when things like that happen, there are entrepreneurs out there who are constantly trying to fill these gaps in the market, and I actually have to say they come up with quite innovative and creative ideas out there to make money. And it's very important that it's very important, how entrepreneurship exists, how entrepreneurship actually fills those gaps in the market and helps our economy. Those things are actually really important, and that is what's currently happening right now. So in total, last year there were actually 407,005 or rather 407,505 new businesses across all sectors in the United Kingdom, right? And I'm talking about all the sectors, right? This is IT, IT, technology, food, health, whatever it is. There was actually a lot of new businesses that were born during the pandemic. Now, this is the first time where we've seen these entrepreneurs come up with new business ideas to try and save the economy, because we've seen those things happen in the past as well. So if anything, if you look into the past, you can actually learn a lesson from how to deal with all the negative effects that you're facing because of the pandemic, right? And another thing that needs to be kept in mind, obviously, is that when it comes to a pandemic, a lot of us tend to be negative, a lot of us tend to have a pessimistic outlook on life in the middle of a pandemic, especially when your economy is falling, when you're feeling the effects of it so badly. For example, right now, a lot of us are stuck at home. We're feeling very monotonous. Our lives are feeling very routinal, and it makes you feel very negative, right? It's like you don't want to wake up in the morning every day because your routine, it's the same. It's so routinal, if I put it that way. Everything, it's the same thing that happens every day. You wake up, you do your work, you have your food, then you sleep. That's literally how it works, and it's tiring because obviously, as human beings, we like change. even though we take a lot of time to adapt to change, we like change, we constantly like having to, having different things to do. But when this pandemic happened, it cut off a lot of those different things that we could do, and because of that we were just isolated, we were stuck at home, and we didn't really have any other things to do. So obviously, when you're constantly, when you're going through things, when you're constantly experiencing negative feelings, experiencing negative thoughts, it's very important that you have these new businesses, you have new ideas to actually wake up to, and start your own business. That's what I'm talking about. And obviously, another link that economists have drawn between the pandemic and the supply side of the economy is actually the use of labor saving technology. Now, this is something that's expected. Now, this a pandemic isn't the only instance this has happened, but it has also happened in other instances, because we've seen how people have actually or rather bosses have actually invested in labor saving technology. And if you actually think about it, it's more profitable for them to invest in labor saving technology rather than investing or paying salaries to employees, because unlike employees or unlike humans, these machines don't really get sick, right? And they do not get diseases, and they do not fall ill. So if you look at it in their perspective, it's so much more advantageous for them, and it's something that they would consider doing, and it has been done as well, right? Because if you look at it, again, people are working from home these days because bosses want to cut down costs, especially given the fact that you aren't earning as much as you used to, or your output isn't as much as you used to. It means that the profit has visibly reduced, right? That means that you need to come up with other alternatives for ways in which you can cut down costs, and that's exactly what they're doing by making us work from home. Like, sure, it's easier for us, it's convenient for us, and sometimes it helps our productivity, but also at the same time, if you look at it, you also need to understand that what they're doing is actually making sure that they can cut down these costs, right? And a paper by the researchers at the International Monetary Fund actually looked at a number of recent outbreaks of these diseases like Ebola and SARS, and finds that pandemic events actually accelerate robot adoption, especially when the health impact is severe and it is associated with a significant economic downturn, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing right now, right? It's so much more easier for all these bosses to invest in technology, because there is a lot of downfall because of the pandemic, there is a lot of health impacts because of the pandemic, and obviously, like I said before, it's so much more easier to adopt these technologies and to keep your business going, especially because the productivity of machines is pretty much consistent, in comparison to humans whose consistency isn't, or rather whose productivity isn't consistent, right? And obviously, another thing that needs to be understood was this was also seen in the 1920s, especially after the Spanish flu. There was a rapid automation that was happening all across the world. And if you look back, to when the Black Death happened as well, it was also during that time when when the printing press was actually invented. So it obviously goes to show that when people get sick, when people are going through pandemics, when things like that happen, people actually tend to, or rather bosses tend to find ways in which you can automate the whole thing, in which you can get technology to do it, because it's so much more easier. And another thing that needs to be understood, or another thing that needs to be seen, is although this sounds like quite a very, or rather an inhumane mechanism, it needs to be understood that when these diseases happen, when there are pandemics and when people die, it actually leaves all the survivors out there in a stronger bargaining position, because they survived, they actually are there, and they can make it to work. So obviously, when things like this happen, it's almost, ironically and very inhumanly, it's a very fittest, survival of the fittest kind of mechanism, right? So obviously, when things like that happen, people are actually in a higher bargaining position. They can ask for these jobs, they can ask for pay rises, and they can ask for different things, especially if that means that, if it means getting them back to work to make sure that they can earn a GDP, or if they can, have an output the same way they had way before the pandemic happened. So obviously, that is very important, but stay tuned, because we'll be back in a little bit to talk about how economic consequences are there, especially after political upheaval. So make sure you stay tuned for that, because I'll be back in a few to talk about to you about I will be back to talk to you about all of these things.
Again. But now if you say to a child, if I went up to a child and said, "You've had one to forget," God, there'd be an inquest. Me, why did you reject my son? Oh, I haven't rejected your son.
I want to talk about, how the generation gap, how much it's changed, especially when you check the youth nowadays in comparison, to people back in the day.
I'd say when I was younger, it was more disciplined. Not now.
In comparison to now.
Not at all. Not now. The way things are nowadays, the younger generation, you seem that they can't accept the word no. If that makes sense. They can't
accept rejection, essentially, is all you're trying to say.
Yeah, they can't accept the word no. So if you, how did I do? Well, you didn't do very well. And they get upset, And when I was a youngster, my father used to say to me, because I used to be sport mad when I was very young. Well, I still am sport mad, but like participating in different sports. And if I had a bad game, for example, I'd say to me, "You had one to forget." That's it.
Your dad sounds like a smart guy. I mean, yeah, that's the real fact of the matter, yeah.
He'd say to me, "You had one to forget. Get over it." And that was it. So I dust myself down and do it again. But now, if you say to a child, if I went up to a child and said, "You've had one to forget," God, there'd be an inquest. Me, why did you reject my son? Oh, I haven't rejected your son. Or daughter. I've just told them that they need to buck their ideas up.
That's the truth right there. I mean, if you think about it, if you check the generations, like right now in the US as well, I've seen a lot of these things as well. In the UK, you get medals for participation. But what's the point? What are you trying to? Yeah, what's the point? Either you win or you lose. People are so afraid to put that whole notion of losing. When it comes to right now, the generation gap is just crazy. How much a lot has changed. Social media has taken control of our lives, and we don't even realize it anymore. We're crippled because of it.
That's absolutely right, Nick. Because as you said, nowadays it seems that you get rewarded for failure. For the life of me, Nick, I can't get my head around that. Perhaps I'm just getting old and morbid, I don't know. I just can't get my head around how you could be rewarded for failure.
Climb Mount Everest. That is that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do, hopefully.
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. I mean, okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest, maybe the base camp at least.
You're talking about mental health. Well, if you went out and got some exercise in the fresh air, that would improve your mental health. It will make you feel better.
That's true. That is true. I wholeheartedly agree. But then for some people, it's how do you find the motivation? Especially when it comes to riding a bicycle, to do it again and again and again and again. It's a cycle that you have to be used to. How do you do it? What makes you wake up in the morning and decide, hey, I'm going to pick my bike up today. I'm going to cycle. What makes you want to do that?
What makes me want to do that?
Yeah. What do you like? What could you give listeners, like people listening in right now? What kind of tip could you give them?
Well, the first tip I would give them, if you haven't tried it before, try it. It can open up new horizons. It'll make you fitter. It will definitely make you fitter. Cycling is one of the best forms of aerobic exercise you can do.
It sounds like, if you think about it, yeah, it sounds like great fun. Because what essentially you're trying to say is also at the same time, when if you look at it from this perspective, with regards to mental health, especially when you look at it with mental health, this is another way to fight it. I feel like you go outside, you meet more people, you interact with, socially, you will interact with more people, and you're keeping fit, you're making connections, you're breathing in the good and exhaling the bad. I feel like that's a great thing right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got a better way with words than I have, I'll tell you. But you're quite right. What you say there.
I've been doing this for quite some time. Hey, you'll get the hang of it.
I've been doing it for about 10 minutes now, so yeah.
That I can never really understand people staying in one room the whole day when you can have the world to see. I am a traveler. I travel. I love traveling. Traveling is just one of the things I do. And yeah, on top of my bucket list was, to one time, hopefully when I get there, go to Nepal and climb Mount Everest. That is one of my that's in my bucket list. You're laughing, but that is the facts right there. I'd love to do that. That is something I'm looking forward to do. Hopefully,
Climb Everest.
Mount Everest. Okay, not the very tip of Mount Everest. Maybe the base camp at least.
Base camp, yeah.
At least.
Would you be able to cycle there?
Oh.
The Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope. And if you're just tuning in earlier, we were talking about the pandemic, where we were talking about the post-pandemic economy and all the different changes that will be there, obviously, after this pandemic, and also the different changes that we are currently going through right now. So that's what we were talking about. And I'm super excited to be here. If you're just tuning in, a very good morning. And if you have any messages, if you have any thoughts, any opinions that you would like to share with us, you can do so. All you need to do is just text me on 07852473473, and I will answer them and I will respond to them, and I will maybe even share them on this, on this discussion that we're currently having about the post-pandemic boom, right? So obviously that is what we're talking about. So earlier, we were talking about how there's going to be differences, or rather how people are going to be more encouraged, or they will find new ways to spend their money. They will find new ways to start businesses, especially because they need to have some form of income, especially in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that's what we were talking about. Now let's move on into political changes. Actually, let's talk about how political changes have unpredictable economic consequences, and how we've also seen that happen in different parts of the world, and why it is so important for why it's so important when it comes to the post pandemic economy, right? So obviously, something that needs to be understood is that a lot of people have suffered in huge numbers, right, all around the world. It's not just here in the UK, but also in the US, in all the other countries. There have been a lot of people that have suffered, and when we're talking about all these people that have suffered, and all, when we're talking about how much they have suffered, especially not only because of the disease, but also when it comes to things like not having enough income to provide for yourselves or your family. When it comes to things like that, when it comes to people not having their jobs, or a lot of people losing their jobs, or even people losing some of that income they used to get, obviously we need to understand that attitudes may shift towards workers, right? And that seems to be happening this time as well, because policymakers around the world are less interested in reducing the public debt and warding off inflation, instead of getting unemployment down, right? Because the main focus right now seems to be about reducing public debt and trying to get off inflation, trying to reduce inflation as well. Just and not really focus on the fact that employment is rising at the moment, right? And that's very important, because you need to always talk about, or you need to address unemployment. Right now, I understand that we're in the middle of a pandemic. I understand things might be difficult. It's definitely so much more difficult than before to actually talk about to actually reduce the number of unemployment that is, or to reduce the percentage of unemployment that is right now. But what needs to be understood is, because of this change in the attitude towards these workers, because the government rather is constantly focusing on other things like public debt and warding off inflation, they're not really talking about unemployment. They're not really trying to address that issue, and they're not really trying to provide a solution for that either, right? And a new paper that was actually published by the London School of Economics finds that COVID-19 has also made people across Europe very, or rather, not like inequality. Because obviously, if you think about it, nobody likes inequality. A lot of us disagree, or we're very against inequality because of all the effects that it has on everyone in society. And I'm not just talking about people from low income families. I'm not talking about people who are just in the middle class. But also what needs to be understood is this inequalities tend to exacerbate already existing conditions, right? And things like poverty, things like crime, those things actually tend to be exacerbated so much more, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So obviously, when it's pretty obvious that a lot of people across the world are against inequality, a lot of people are trying to fight inequality and trying to make sure that everyone has equal healthcare, equal help when it comes to the pandemic. A lot of people are changing their stances and they're calling out these governments for inequality, right? And obviously, like I said, a lot of the pressures that are there during a pandemic, trying to get unemployment down, trying to reduce inflation, a lot of these pressures have actually in some instances exploded into political disaster. Now, if anything, the best example for that was actually the Trump administration. We saw how the rise in COVID cases, we saw how the rise in misinformation, how the rise in these conspiracy theories actually ended up in a huge political upheaval, causing great chaos all across the United States. And also, it has a lot of economic consequences. Now, while they're still coming to terms with it, while they're still trying to struggle, or they're trying to try to adjust themselves to all those huge economic consequences that is currently existing because of all that political disorder. It's very obvious that if people, or rather if politicians, if governments don't take that into account, that things couldn't would not actually go that well for them either, because you need to definitely make sure that you focus on the normal people much less than you focus on the rich people, right? And what I mean when I say that is that because a lot of people out there is just normal people. When you compare the percentages of rich and poor, or rich and middle income, people who are poor or middle income, the percentage of people who are poor or middle income is definitely so much more higher than rich people. So then we understand that majority of society, or what society wants, actually depends on the needs of on the needs of the people who belong to the majority, which is obviously people from low income backgrounds or people from middle income backgrounds, right? And obviously, like I said, when pandemics expose it and accentuate the pre-existing inequalities, it also leads those onto the wrong side of the bargain who are looking to redress. Okay, and obviously now this is very important, because when you're trying to address this situation, when you're trying to make it so much better, when you're trying to solve all these problems that are created by the pandemic, if you aren't necessarily addressing them the way it should be addressed, then that can mean a lot of disaster, can mean a lot of chaos for your government, or whoever is in power as well. So it's very important that we keep these things in mind when we're trying to address these situations. Now, for example, if you take Ebola, the whole Ebola outbreak that was there from 2013 to 2016, it actually increased civil violence in West Africa by 40%. And that was just according to one study. So obviously, it just goes to show that when you don't address these problems, when situations are exacerbated by pandemics, it just goes to show that there is increased violence, right? Now, recent research from the International Monetary Fund actually considered five of the most recent pandemics, and that included Ebola, SARS, and Zika, and it was actually focused on 133 countries since 2001, right? And one significant thing that they found was that there was an increase in social unrest. And they also said that it is reasonable to expect that, because as the pandemic fades, unrest actually re-emerges in locations where it previously existed, right? And what needs to be understood is, after the pandemic, the social unrest tends to be so much more exacerbated. It tends to be so much worse, because obviously, like I said, because of all the issues that these people have had to face, because of all the inequality they've had to face, and because of all the difficulties they've had to face in the middle of a pandemic, it's obviously going to be so much worse, right? Because this is the anger, this is the frustration, and the government, or whoever is in and who's in charge of the government, and this is how they get back at them. It's by violence, it's by trying to get over how much they lost, trying to get over all the frustration by violence, right? Obviously it's not the best way to do it, that's not even the correct way, and that's not what people should be doing. But it's just that when instances like this happen, when people are caught up in instances like this, they have no choice but to actually become violent, because they're so frustrated, they've lost their income, they've lost even family members, because we're talking about a pandemic, right? And obviously when they're going through so much of loss, when they're marginalized, when they're isolated, and when they themselves can see the huge inequalities that exist within society, simply because of the income they earn, or even how much because of the income they earn, or even the fact that they don't have much money, people obviously will get angry, people will get restless. And that is why it's very important that people, or even governments, address these issues, try to address these issues way before the pandemic, way before this way before social unrest peaks. Now apparently it takes 2 years after the pandemic ends for social unrest to peak, so it's very important that governments focus on these things as well, right? Now, like I said, eventually in the long run, eventually after a while, the pandemic, or rather the economy, will recover, right? Because it's this constant cycle. You can't constantly be at one position as well. There'll be a rise, there'll be a fall, there will be when you hit rock bottom, and there will be when you hit peak as well. So obviously the economy is a cycle, it will eventually get better, it will eventually develop, and people will eventually be better. But for that future to be much better, governments actually need to focus on these existing problems. Because even if you achieve that future, even if that future is already here, if you haven't solved any of the other problems that existed before that, then there's absolutely no purpose, or there is no point in all of that, in all of the strength or all of the effort you put into creating that future. Because people are still going to be marginalized, people are still going to be discriminated, I mean, people are going to still be treated very unfairly. So it's very important that political leaders address these issues. And that is why it was very important to discuss the post-pandemic boom, especially in terms of what is happening right now. Now stay tuned, because I'll be back in a few minutes to talk to you about the fashion industry and how much the fashion industry has changed, because there's a lot of news in the fashion industry right now. So make sure you stay tuned for that. But obviously I'll be here in a few more minutes, so make sure you stay tuned.